Today I'm going to be painting a sign for a customer of ours. It's a large multi-layered aluminum sign. It's going to have a nice big background piece and then some aluminum appliques that are bolted on there. So I figured this would be a good time for me to show you the process for painting aluminum, getting paint to stick properly to your metal and making sure that it's outdoor worthy, if you will. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so we've covered the concept of mechanical adhesion a few times in previous videos on my channel, but basically the idea is the paint needs something to grip onto, and a lot of paints aren't designed to stick to metal, so this is particularly important for them, particularly if you're not using a self-etching primer, which you should, but you don't necessarily need to. You can get away with an adhesion promoter or something like that as long as the metal is properly abraded and cleaned. So the first thing that we need to do, even if you are using a self-etching primer, is to abrade the metal, scratch it up basically. So there are several ways to do this. You can use a Scotch pad or sandpaper. That's a popular one. My personal favorite for things that will fit in it is to use a sandblasting unit. You don't need a sandblasting unit. You can get a handheld sandblaster, which I've got, but they make a heck of a mess. So this one is self-contained. It's got a vacuum in it, and it doesn't make a heck of a mess. So here I've got one of the pieces of aluminum that I'm going to be painting. It's a little dirty right now, but that doesn't matter. I'll clean it after I'm done sandblasting it. So what I'm going to do is roughen up the surface in order to allow the paint to stick to it better. Now what I'm using in this thing isn't actually sand. You can use sand in a sandblasting unit, obviously, but in order to get a finer finish, you either go with fine sand, or in this case we have aluminum oxide, which is extremely fine. It also electrocutes you a little bit while you're doing it, so it's always a good idea to be grounded while you're using one of these. Now this piece is frosted and ready to paint, and if you look at it, it's white now. It was silver before. It looks, well, considerably lighter. I don't know if I can pick up, will that focus on there? The finish on it, yeah. It's nice and smooth, but it's not so smooth that paint won't stick. It has been abraded, and it's gonna basically be as though I sanded it pretty much perfectly with about 600 or 800 grit paper. So I'm going to go ahead and do this to all of the parts that will fit in this thing for our sign, and then we'll get to the painting stage. For larger pieces like the background of the sign, obviously you can't fit them into that sandblaster, and like I said, it makes a heck of a mess if you're shooting aluminum oxide all over the place, and it's quite bad for you actually if you're not wearing a respirator. I'm not the only one who works here, so I can't really fill the place up with sand, especially not when I'm going to be painting. So for abrading or scuffing for larger pieces, you can use pretty much anything. You can go from something as complicated as using your DA sander all the way down to what I'm going to be doing today, which is a simple piece of gray Scotch-Brite. So all you're trying to achieve here, when I told you about scuffing clear coat previously, sorry, I just kind of cut myself off in the middle of a sentence there, but when I told you about scuffing clear coat, I did it twice, I told you that you wanted to continue to scuff it until the gloss was gone. Now, that's until it's not shiny anymore, right? On a piece of metal, it's going to be shiny when you scuff it, typically. When you sandblast it, it's not. But even with this stuff, if I go back and forth, I can take some of the shine out of there, but really I'm just getting a different kind. So what you need to do here is make sure that every surface, when you look at it from various angles, has some form of scratching on it. Now if there are tiny little gaps between the scratches where it's still shiny, that's not a huge problem. Your paint will adhere to itself and bridge those gaps. But generally speaking, it's always good to have as much of it well scuffed as possible, and that keeps you from having to worry about your paint finding those spots where it wasn't attached quite right and peeling in those areas. So there's no point in you watching me do this, and it's not like it's a huge display of skill. So I'm going to go ahead and finish scuffing this up, and then we'll move on to the next step. Alright guys, next up on the nonsense list is ensuring that your metal is clean. Now it might look clean, it might even feel clean, but metal tends to get quite dirty. In fact, just give me a second here, I'll show you what I mean. This piece of aluminum looks pretty clean right now. So does my hand. But if I go ahead and take my hand and rub it along there, despite the fact that it looks clean and it actually feels pretty clean, it's very, very not clean. Okay. If I felt like it, I would edit that out so it looked like I teleported back here, but I'm probably going to be too lazy. Anyway, so we need to clean these. Same goes for the frosted pieces. You need to make sure that those are good and clean. If you're cleaning something that already has paint on it, I advise you to use something along the lines of wax and grease remover, or maybe Windex, even lighter fluid you can usually get away with. You can do that on the metal as well. There's no reason not to. My personal preference is to use something a little stronger on the metal. So I'm going to use methanol. Now don't use that on something that's been painted. It's a solvent. It could very well eat through your paint and ruin your paint job. But for raw metal, there's no reason not to use it. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean all of the appliques and the background now with methanol. And then we'll be ready to start painting. Alright guys, so since I cleaned this, I gave it about 5 or 10 minutes just to make sure that it was good and dry. And then I sprayed some adhesion promoter onto it very lightly. Sorry that I didn't show that, but what I'm using for this is AutoAir paint. You've probably noticed I use that a lot, even for work stuff, because my boss insists that I use water-based paint as much as possible, mostly for safety. And I have no problem with that. It works just as well and just as quickly if you do it right. So I'm using the AutoAir line for this, and they specify that on things like aluminum, when it's been properly prepared like this has, that you don't need adhesion promoter or primer or anything like that. You just start with the sealer. Now in order to, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, in order to cover my ass, I guess. To make sure that this sticks properly, I have put down some adhesion promoter. Primer works just as well, if not better. But it shouldn't be a problem anyway, because this is scuffed down to an appropriate degree for the paint to stick. So what I'm spraying now is AutoAir Sealer Dark. And I'm going to spray the entire thing in that. This background is going to be a bright pearlescent aluminum look. Obviously I can't just leave it raw aluminum, but it's going to be a sparkly silver. So I'm going to start with the black. You'll notice that I'm not wearing a respirator. I probably should be, but this is water-based. I'm in a huge room, and my respirator isn't within immediate arm's reach. I advise you to wear a respirator if you're doing this. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. Hopefully from my previous videos you'll recall, I keep stepping back into this light, you'll recall that this paint is intended to go on very lightly in several coats. But in case you haven't seen my previous videos, this paint's intended to go on lightly in several coats. So let's get started. So when you're painting a large surface area like a sign or something like that, where you're going to have to be walking back and forth like you just saw me do, there are some important things that you need to consider. First of all, you always need to be aware of your air hose. Keep it somewhere where you're not going to trip on it, because that'll cause you to, jump or something and put a run in your paint or it'll cause you a problem. So make sure your hose is in a good place. I always keep mine in my other hand so I'm aware of where it is. I will often put it around behind my back as well. It's not really an issue for this piece because of where it's located, but if I'm working on something where there's a risk of the hose hitting it, then I always keep it behind my back. For example, if I was doing a car, I would keep the hose behind me, well away from where I'm actually painting. The other thing is, when you're walking like that, you need to develop a way of doing it in order to keep your transition smooth. You want to keep the same pace as you move across so that your hand is moving at the same speed all the time. That was smooth. Anyway, I was moving fairly quickly. My gun is set up not to spray a whole lot of paint out at once. And with this stuff, this paint is very forgiving, so if I had slipped up a little bit, it wouldn't have been a huge issue. But if you're using something like a polyurethane or a paint where you need flow, it's going to be more important that you get it nice and smooth, you make sure that you're moving at the same pace all the time, and you pay attention to how that paint is building up. So unlike with the polyurethane, this paint's ready for another coat now, as opposed to having to wait 10 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and put on another 2 or 3 coats of the sealer and paint all the appliques as well, and then we'll move on to the color.